All right. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to Athletics Canada for giving us the opportunity to speak on the topic of relative energy deficiency in sport. We're going to talk about everything from periods, puberty, to performance in female middle distance and distance athletes. And I'm going to be your moderator today. My name is Hilary Stellingwerf, and I'm a former 1500-meter runner for Canada, a two-time Olympian in London and in Rio. And I retired after Rio, and now I'm the head men's and women's cross country and track coach at the University of Victoria, and a mother of a 2-year-old and a 6-year-old. So I'm excited to be here. And before we begin, I just want to acknowledge that we did receive some criticism about the lack of diversity on our panel. And that's an absolutely fair comment and a critique that we don't take lightly. The injustices we're seeing everywhere related to racism and prejudice, as well as the movement around Black Lives Matter, is eye-opening and really necessary. So with respect to this panel, the intent of the selection was the fact that we know REDS disproportionately affects women in the middle and distance events. And so we pulled together our Canadian record holders in the female distance and middle distance events to talk to you about this in detail. This is a really sensitive and intimate topic. I've had conversations with all of these women about this topic, and that's why I feel comfortable asking them these questions. However, we know REDS does still affect a more diverse population when it comes to race, sex, and event groups. So today we hope to just get this conversation going and extend it in future webinars or forums to a more diverse group and see where we go from there. So without further ado, I really want to introduce our wonderful panel of ladies. I'm going to start with Dr. Margot Mountjoy, who's an MD, PhD, and on the IOC Medical Commission. She also was leading the REDS consensus statement from the IOC, and she works as Athletics Canada medical physician, among other sports. And then we have Melissa Bishop, our Canadian 800-meter record holder, World Championship silver medalist, Olympian in 800, and mother of one, a 2-year-old, just one. Sorry, Melissa. And then Gabriella Debus Stafford, Canadian 1500-meter and 5K record holder, World Championship finalist, and Olympian in 1500. Melindy Almore, 2019 Canadian marathon record holder, and 2004 Olympian in 1500. I had to make those years because it's clear and it's so special. And the mother of 2 boys, a 2-year-old and 6-year-old. And then Genevieve Lalonde, Canadian 3,000 meter steeplechase record holder, world championship and Olympic finalist in the steeplechase. So thank you, ladies, for joining us today. Just a couple things before we begin. Everybody who's watching is muted. If you have questions, please address them in the dialog box on your screen, and we'll try to get to those questions in the last 15 minutes of this webinar. We won't be able to answer everybody's, but we'll do our best. And this webinar will be recorded, so it will be on the AC site in the coaches section, and any coaches that have registered will get 1 point from Pro-D point with their NCCP number. So first, before we get to the conversation with the panelists, Margot Mountjoy has made a presentation for us that I'm going to show you, and then we'll get to a discussion. So we'll try this technology here.
Hello, my name is Margot Mountjoy and I work with Athletics Canada, and I'd like to thank Athletics Canada for having me speak today to you about REDS. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you find this informative. So I am a clinical professor at McMaster University, and I also work with the IOC as the lead author on the REDS consensus statement. So let's start off with the case. Let's talk about a 19-year-old elite runner that has hip pain when she's walking for about 2 weeks. And she's not had her period for about 12 months prior to this. She's had 2 stress fractures in the past, one in her foot and one in her shin. And she denies any troubles with eating disordered behaviors, but noticed lately that her performance is falling off a little bit during practice, and her coach wants her to train continually because she's got a Diamond League event coming up. So we do an x-ray, and this is what her femur looks like. And I hope you can see that bright spot right there in the middle of the slide. And that bright spot is a stress fracture in the neck of the femur. So that's right up high in the hip. And that's a very important and worrisome stress fracture because it can lead to more serious complications. So you can see in this case study that this athlete has had some significant difficulties, likely. Let's talk about what is REDS, and I'll go back in time because we can understand REDS by starting back to see how the science evolved over time. So about, well, a little over 20 years ago or so, Barbara Drinkwater, a researcher in the US, coined the phrase female athlete triad, which at that point was thought to be eating disorders, no periods, and thin bones. So those were the 3 points of. Then over time, in 2007, the ACSM, which is the American College of Sports Medicine, um, revamped the female athlete triad to show that it occurs over time, that it's a continuum and an interrelationship, and that there's varying degrees of the different 3 points to that triad. But what we found over time is that the underpinning cause of the triad was actually being energy deficient. And energy deficiency depends on how much energy you take in through eating and how much you spend through exercise and also through daily living and walking around every day, your heart beating, growing hair, digesting your food, breathing. All of these things take energy. But as athletes, a lot of our energy expenses come from sport and training. So the energy deficiency comes when either the energy intake isn't enough to account for your energy expenses or you're overspending energy. We found also that this problem occurs not only in women, but occurs in athletes as well. That it's not really a triad, that in fact the energy deficiency is the core cause and that many other body systems are affected other than menstrual cycle. And so to define it, the IOC working group calls it it's a syndrome that refers to impaired functioning caused by the energy deficiency that affects both metabolism, menstrual function, bone, immunity, protein synthesis, as well as heart health. We know that REDS occurs in many sports in males and females. A lot of the sports affected mainly are the endurance athletes. Also can affect the judge sport athletes like artistic swimmers and figure skaters, but also weight-dependent sports and weight classification sports. We also know from some work done in Canada that female sprinters can also have REDS, but most of the REDS we see are in the endurance middle long distance groups. So what are the health consequences? Well, we've talked about some today, and you can see the triad in red there where the energy deficiency and the menstrual function and bone health. But look at all of the other possible health outcomes of REDS. Can affect metabolism, blood counts in terms of iron metabolism, can affect growth in people who haven't finished growing yet, can affect psychological health, heart health, GI, which is tummy and digestive health, as well as immunity. Now, note the psychological one has an arrow in both directions because psychological health is the only body system where the problem can actually occur from psychological problems. For example, the energy restriction in an eating disorder or an anorexic person can actually cause the REDS as opposed to REDS causing the health consequences. So that's the only one where the arrow goes both ways. So let's take a few of these and look at them a little more closely, and we'll talk more with the other panelists about period problems, but we do know in the science that there may be some long-term period issues with fertility, and that the period problem with REDS is well documented, and there could be an emotional impact as well for cycles. From the other hormone systems, we know that sugar is, so glucose, how your body uses glucose is altered with REDS, as well as the metabolism and mobilization of fat. The metabolic rate is slowed down and growth hormone resistance. So these hormones are very important things in the healthy functioning of your body. And when the energy is deficient, they can all be affected in a negative way, both for your health and performance. If we look at bone, we know that low estrogen from REDS can have a negative impact on your bone. But low energy available, even irrespective of the low estrogen, can also have a negative impact on your bone, and as well an increased risk of stress fracture, which we all want to avoid. From the psychological side, there can be depression coming from REDS, as well as disordered eating and eating disorders. Let's spend a moment and look at the performance consequences. So you can see the energy deficiency is in the core as the cause, again in the center here of this diagram. But look at all of the different possible performance consequences from REDS. We can have decreased training response, increased risk of injury, decreased endurance performance, inability to utilize the glycogen stores. Some of the mood and irritability changes can affect your training focus as well. So there's one wonderful study that shows the decreased training effect if you have REDS. So this is, I'll just walk you through this very simple study where these young women were swimmers. Sorry, they're not athletics athletes, they're swimmers. And half of the group had healthy normal periods and the other half did not have periods, correct? These women did a 4-month training block. And before the training block, sorry, it was a 12-week training block, but before the training block, they did a 400-meter time trial. All of the athletes got the same training block. And then at the end, they had another 400-meter time trial. Now, interestingly, the athletes that had normal periods got faster. And this is what we expect. You know, you have a certain time, you do a training block, and you get faster. So that's the group that had healthy periods, got 8.2% faster. Now, very interesting, look at the red bar. These are the women that had suppressed ovarian function. These are the women that had REDS with no periods. They actually got over 9% slower with the same training program. Now, you put effort into a training program, you want to get faster, you don't want to get slower. So, in fact, having good energy availability will actually help your training program, and having REDS or low energy availability will decrease your training response. There's another study in Australian rowers. This also had a pre and post 5K time trial. And after in a 4-week interval of heavy training in between the pre and post 5K time trial. And you can see from the graph here that in the fourth quarter of the race, these athletes, their performance fell off and they weren't able to continue at the same pace. So their endurance was affected by having REDS. So they had a lower resting metabolic rate, they had significant body composition changes, they complained of more fatigue, and they had lowering of their energy availability that affected their performance in the fourth quarter of the race. Here's a nice study done by Canadian athletes with Trent Stellenworth and as well as Ida Haikura, looking at endurance athletes, both male and female, in Flagstaff at altitude prior to Rio. And the hemoglobin mass was lower in those athletes that didn't have periods versus the group that had periods. And the expected increase that we were expecting in the hemoglobin mass in the athletes with low energy availability was blunted, which means they didn't get the response. So if you come in with a hemoglobin here and we expect an altitude for it to end up here, what happened is those athletes without periods, it only came up to here. So just to show that it's very important to have a good energy availability if you want to get the altitude effects. And there was a negative correlation between the low energy availability questionnaire score and the percent change in hemoglobin mass, just to show that it's important to have proper energy availability if you want to get altitude effects. We know also that those athletes who have low energy availability are more susceptible to viral infections. You think, well, it's just a cold. But if your cold happens at your Olympic Games or World Championships or national event, it's not good for your performance. So trying to prevent viral illnesses can be prevented or at least decrease the incidence of viral illnesses by having good energy availability and no. We also know that athletes with low energy availability have an increased risk of injury, and in particular bone stress injuries, but other injuries as well. Well documented. So what's our goal of treatment with REDS? We want to achieve optimal energy availability for your health and performance while allowing training and sport participation at a safe and appropriate level. So that's kind of the overarching principles when we treat REDS is how do we provide the optimum energy availability for your health and performance while you. So we have a little model that we use when we're training and treating athletes with REDS. We have a red zone where we may have an athlete that's quite got severe health problems and extreme health consequences from the REDS. And this is a very high risk concerning group of athletes. Another group of athletes that we measure their various things that we have on the list here. We won't go through them all, but we measure all of these things and then categorize them into a high or a moderate risk or risk where we have everything under good control and good energy availability for health and performance. What do we do if this athlete lands up in the high risk range? These athletes are not allowed to train, not allowed to compete, and we treat them for their health and safety to get them back into sport as soon as is healthy possible. The athlete may, in the moderate risk range, if they classified in that range, we allow them to train as long as they're following the treatment plan and they can compete once they're medically cleared under supervision. So that's where we're trying to move them into that green zone where they can have full sport participation without any monitoring required. So the goal is to have all our athletes in the green and we can move them from the red to the yellow and the yellow into the green through the treatment program. And how does that look? Well, you'll have a physician working with the athlete, and the physician's responsible for assessing the risk, managing the medical issues, and the physician has the final say in the return to play decision making. The dietitian is very important because the dietitian will be reviewing the energy availability, the types of foods they should be eating, the timing of the foods, and addressing any disordered eating. A psychologist or psychotherapist will be dealing with any underlying psychological issues. What I didn't have room on the slide here, of course, is for the sport physiologists. That is a very important part of this team to work with everyone to make sure that the appropriate training is involved. We do involve the coach at the last stages of that. The coach should be informed along the way, but really the treatment of REDS is something that's done with a team of experts. The coach is very important for supporting for and implementing if any energy restrictions are required in the training load. We may contract with the athlete. Now, I don't expect you to read this, but this is a very standardized treatment contract where we contract with the athlete to attend certain health assessments as well as meet certain changes in nutrition, perhaps weight changes for their safe return to sport. So the rate of correction depends on the athlete motivation and how ill they are at the time when we start, but the periods can take months to years to come back. So this is really important that you don't think, I'm eating really well, it's been a week, how come I don't have my period? We expect it to take months to years, and the good work that you do in the interim before your period comes is very good for your health nonetheless. And bone restoration may never normalize, but often does improve over time. Now, as we know, bone materializes faster during a critical time period, a window during adolescence, and slows down after the age of 24. So bone density improvements change at different rates. When we look at improving bone density, we want to make sure the athlete's taking enough calcium and vitamin D to ensure that they've got all the good nutrients to increase their bone density. And we encourage athletes to avoid the birth control pill because it may have a negative effect on bone health, and it also masks whether or not you're having regular periods. So if birth control is needed, then an IUD, a non-hormonal IUD, is recommended if we're worried about REDS, but that's a decision made with your treating physician. And if the athlete has thin bones, we can use a patch of estrogen with oral progesterone to help strengthen those bones. However, that's not a viable form of birth control. So for menstrual function, if it's not resuming after about 6 months to a year, we may consider that the athlete's not really compliant with the training program. Maybe their metabolism is just adjusting, and we may need to add in something to protect their bones. So this is just an overview of what is REDS. what some of the performance and health consequences are, as well as the risk stratification, assessment, and treatment goals are. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
All right. Thank you, Margot, for that great presentation. It was very informative. And also what really hits home for me is how complicated REDS is and how multifaceted it is. So the big thing from my perspective is that it can be stigmatized as having an eating disorder when that's not necessarily the case. So it's great that we have people willing to discuss their journeys and the ebbs and flows of going through puberty and dealing with different factors of performance. And so, yeah, I would like to start with talking about adolescent and junior performance and the development that each of you had. So maybe we can start with Gabriella, if maybe you could walk us through what your sport development was like in the youth and junior years. Did you do other sports? How did you get into track? And at what age did you focus on track?
Yeah, sure. Hey, can everybody hear me okay? So I think I was quite lucky that I didn't have to kind of deal with that puberty development and dealing with my body changing. I did that before I kind of started training in track at a serious age. Like I guess I probably started puberty at the age of 10, got my first period at the age of 13, and was quite lucky that I was pretty regular quickly. And I didn't start training with Terry Rodchenko, who's was my high school coach and my university coach at the University of Toronto until I was 15. So I was quite like well established in my new body when I started training at a serious level. And so there wasn't a lot of like learning about my new body while running, but at a younger age, I did Irish dancing quite seriously. And you know, I would play like school sports teams and soccer and stuff like that. So and I also ran at like the age of 9, but just with my school, like just for fun, nothing like super serious or anything like that.
Great, thanks. Yeah, that is interesting. Yeah, just to hear about the different sports that you played. I think there's several middle distance women in Canada that did Irish dancing, so there's something to that. Yeah.
Yeah, Connell's one of them, and I think Shannon Ropery also did Irish dancing. So we had
Yeah,
some
I
good.
think you're right. Yeah, cool. There you go. A little plug for Irish dancing.
Yeah.
All right. Melissa, I want to ask you also, what age did you start having success as a runner, and what did that look like for you at that young age? And how much training were you doing in your early years versus like late high school?
Yeah, so I think I started to have the most success when I hit like 15, 16, like really my early years of high school. But coincidentally, that's also when I got my period too, is when I was 15. But I was also a multi-sport athlete too. I played hockey and volleyball. I step danced for a really long time. Like so I wasn't track specific, so track wasn't my main focus. I wasn't working out all that much. I mean, compared to my high school counterparts, I was because I was in a track and field group, but at the same time, it wasn't every day. I was only training probably 3 times a week for track and field. And then later on in high school, actually, I got on birth control because my periods were so irregular, and I ended up losing my period altogether. But I was also really anemic, and I didn't know it until I got to university and was able to be in contact with a doctor. And like the coach, Dennis, just automatically put me in touch with the doctor because I was sleeping all the time. I didn't have a period, and soon enough, we figured that we had to take care of this. And as soon as I took care of my anemia, like things really turned around and my period started to come back.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. It is, it can happen by accident, right? We don't always have this situation where, oh, I don't want to eat, or I'm, dealing with lots of different things, and it's okay. Well, you found it through anemia, and
Yeah.
sometimes when we start to train hard as young athletes, it's this by accident, all of a sudden you start to see these RED-S symptoms and don't
Right.
know what they are or how to deal with them.
I actually had my first stress fracture, now that you say this, in my toe prior to leaving for university. So it was just like this, all these signs were popping up, but no one could tell me. No one could tell me what was happening at the time. And I didn't know myself. My parents didn't know. Like, it wasn't something that was talked about.
Yeah, that's yeah, and how do we know until we start these conversations,
That's
until
right.
the information gets out there? So that's a great point. Thanks, Melissa. So let's go to Jen. Jen, would you like to just talk us through when you hit puberty and how did that impact you as an athlete? Because you were really successful as a young athlete, but also you took running as like a play form as well. And so how do you balance that out with body changes and puberty and still trying to perform?
Yeah, I was really lucky that I was also a multi-sport athlete, but running happened to be one of my many sports, and luckily got some good success as a youth athlete, and attended World Youth, and then went on to World Juniors and such. I was a late bloomer, and that's kind of what it was understood in my family that, you know, I was going to probably be a late bloomer. However, I was also lactose intolerant from age 13 to 18, which had a huge impact later on. And so, as Margot was talking about with calcium and vitamin D, those are things that, you know, I was in high school and I was like, why would I take calcium pills? Like, I'm fine. And you kind of think of yourself as invincible until you get to university, and suddenly I was getting my period and I didn't really know what was happening and why I wasn't getting it in some certain times of the year. And then I was getting stress fractures, and I would train for a certain amount of months and then have to hold back because I was getting stress fractures. And luckily, you know, I did I was where Margot is, so I was in Guelph, and I had that support team to kind of diagnose it. And at the time, it was still the female athlete triad, and I also kind of took it as like, oh, but I'm eating a lot. Like, why would I have this if I, like, you know, I'm fueling myself, I'm getting enough rest, like I'm not. I have good iron supplementation, and so it was more just looking at how I was fueling myself, and looking at, you know, okay, how can we regulate training schedules to match, you know, balance recovery to make sure that my whole system was working. And ultimately, yeah, those couple of years were pretty rough, but ultimately led to some success later on. So yeah, very lucky that I had a great team, but you know, it's not everyone who catches those signs, and there's so many signs that I think it's important to look at, you know, every aspect of the athlete.
Yeah, Jen, you bring up a really good point about the crucial element of, as we talk about by accident, if you're missing 300 to 400 calories in a day, one day, no big deal. Several days over and over again, that's a big deal. And it actually, I think, equates to a month of missed meals if you do that every day for a year. And that's where we see these RED-S symptoms really cropping up and causing issues. So it is great, and you were really lucky to have that support. And then Melindy, I just wanted to ask you about how you felt going through puberty, and did you feel frustrated, or how did you perceive the changes that you were dealing with? Did you try to curb them, or you know, how are you feeling? Do you remember? Oh, I can't hear you. Oh, everybody just.
Just say, tell Melinda you can't hear.
Oh,
Melinda, I
sorry.
can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry, I was talking away and not unmuted. So sorry, I'll start again. I was in high school in the 90s, so I feel like I'm kind of dating myself, but these issues weren't super well known back then. However, I feel super fortunate because I had an amazing coach Mike Van Tighem was my high school coach since I was 13, and all through, you know, until I basically retired from the track, aside from my years at Stanford. And he was really proactive in educating us about the changes and body changes, and being really like body positive with the girls, like saying, you know, a lot of times 11, 12, 13-year-old girls will be faster than 14, 15, 16-year-old girls as they're going through puberty, and kind of warning us early that that's okay, that's normal. If it happens, just, you know, be patient, you'll come back. And, you know, really like initiating conversation around healthy habits and having your period and being and expecting that, which for, you know, I think a man in the 90s or even today is like kind of a hard subject to broach. And he did it in a very respectful way, like with my parents around and that sort of thing. So it was done very professionally. So I kind of remember at the time, because I was pretty quick early, like I was like the other girls, multi-sport athlete, playing a lot of sports, not training very hard. Just kind of going to races, and you know, in grade 9 I ran 4:26, just kind of off of soccer training. And he's like, that's pretty quick. And my parents really held me back too. They said, you know, you can't train this hard yet. You're not like, we're not sending you to track 5 or 6 days a week. So they were really proactive about how much energy I expended. I was allowed to do one sport a day. If I had soccer and track on the same day, I had to choose those sorts of things. So I felt like really well prepared and really well supported in a very positive environment. Nevertheless, I still ran into multiple stress factors later in my life, and probably inadvertently found myself in reds at certain times, not purposefully, because I never intended to be in an energy deficit, but just timing and that sort of thing of meals. So I don't even know if I answered the question. I just talked.
No, I think that's really helpful, and it's just really great to hear you share your experiences, because you know, all of you have reached a high level, and we see that you have been able to course correct if there have been issues along the way, and that's important for our young athletes, because I think the biggest gap we see is the transition from junior to senior, and we're losing athletes because they're not able to get to that point, and REDS, I believe, is a big component. So I want to address this with Margot now. What do you think that, what can we do? Should coaches be having conversations with their athletes about REDS or about puberty? And, you know, how would you recommend they start those conversations? Can't hear you.
She can't, looks like she can't unmute.
Can't unmute. Can anyone unmute Margot? Okay. Unfortunately, we can't hear Margot.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yay. Yes, we can.
Yay. So sorry, could you repeat your question, because I lost it while I was trying to unmute myself.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I just want to ask you about what your recommendations would be for coaches or parents to talk to athletes about what they're going through in puberty, and should coaches address this, or should they be, you know, looking at the doctors to address this? How would you recommend we work with this?
Yeah, so a very good question. I think the first thing is that it should be addressed. Now, the second question is, who's the best person to address it? And I think, Melinda, your example is a perfect example of how it was addressed and how it was made normal and how it was done in a respectful way. Now, that was done by your coach because you had a good relationship with your coach. Your coach was professional about it. It was done in the presence of your parents, and it was done as a matter of fact way. And I think that's wonderful. So that worked in your situation. But I think you have to have a coach that's, first of all, comfortable. Second of all, is knowledgeable. And third of all, you have a good relationship with the women that you're working with. And then I would do it with parents involved, because these are minors and we want to be respectful. And these young women are not always comfortable talking about periods, because that means sex and periods and sex, and that's an older man, and there can be, you know, misinterpretation. So it needs to be, first of all, yes, addressed, to answer that question. Second of all, who? I kind of think that the coach may be more appropriate, because they often have a better relationship with the athletes than the physicians. I don't know about you women on the panel here, but physician was probably not a major person in your career as a teenager. They're just not around. You don't go to the physician very often because you're well. So it's only in the later years that when you became more elite that you probably had a closer relationship with a sport physician or a team physician supporting you. So the most influential person at that stage of a junior athlete really is the coach, but the coach would have to be educated, knowledgeable, comfortable, and very professional in dealing with this topic in the presence of parents and as a group.
Yeah, those are great points. I think right on that it's nice that people have access to more information now and just to be able to ask those questions. Just interested from the rest of the panelists if you had anybody broach this issue with you at a young age, or did you feel like you were just dealing with it on your own? Anyone can jump in.
I think Dennis, well, first off, we didn't really know that there was an issue. He just knew that something was off, and not that he was super comfortable talking about periods or things like that, but he was comfortable enough to say, Melissa, I think we need to talk with our team physician about this. And it was just the fact that he brought it up was enough for me to, like, we have a very good relationship, Dennis and I, and it's been built over many years, but that was the start of a really great relationship, that he was respectful enough to say, this may be an issue, let's go get some blood work and see where we can go from there.
Yeah, great. Gabriella, did you want to add anything?
Just to add to that, I was very lucky that I grew up in a very like puberty positive like home. So I remember like when I got my first period, my mom was like really excited. They were like, you know, so it was like kind of like a thing. So it wasn't, at the same time, there was still like some elements that weren't there were some misinformation, right? So like I remember when I started growing breasts, I thought, you know, for like a day I thought I had breast cancer because I was like, what is this new lump? Like I didn't know what was happening. And then I remember like asking my mom and she was like, no, that's like normal. Like you don't just, that's what happens, right? And then when I got my first period, I didn't realize till the next month it was a period because I thought I just pooed my pants because it didn't look like the blood was brown, right? So there was like some elements where there wasn't a lot of knowledge. And I remember my dad, because he trained at a high level in like the 80s, so it was quite common for women not to have their period, and that was seen as normal. So I remember like having conversations with my dad where he said, you know, like when you get to a higher level, like you might lose your period and that's normal. Like I was around many women who lost their period, right? And so there was that knowledge gap. At the same time, I don't know when I realized that like, no, it actually wasn't normal to lose your period. I think it was probably when I started training at U of T, and after about like half a year of training with Terry as a 15-year-old, he like told all the girls in the group, like, okay, you've been with the group for like 6 months, like go get some blood work, check your ferritin levels, because hemoglobin doesn't always give you the whole picture of like from an anemia front. And you know, and so Lucia and I, we both started you know, doing our blood work more regularly, like probably every 6 months. And you know, lo and behold, our ferritin levels were really low. We didn't have like proper anemia yet, but like we were able to catch it early. And so there were those conversations being had, and probably at some point then I kind of clued in that it wasn't normal to lose your period if you were training hard, like you should have your period. And that was kind of something that was more prevalent, you know, like the misinformation was kind of more prevalent in the past. So that's kind of been my experience. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question fully, but
No, that was great insight actually, and I'd like to put this to Margot because I think this is a really important concept, and I know Margot wants to address it because it is a misconception that it's okay as an elite athlete to lose your period. So maybe Margot can talk about that and what your feelings are and expertise, what the research is showing.
So Jen is smiling because she's heard me say this over and over and over and over again. Let's make it very clear right now. It's not okay to train so hard that you lose your period. Now, I'm very sensitive to the fact that we do need to have certain body compositions to have the fastest response. And we do periodize body composition around major competitions, and that's something that's done professionally with sports physiologists and dietitians and physicians at the very elite level. I'm not talking about junior level, development level, at the very elite level. And it is possible that you go into a very controlled short period of energy deficiency to reach that accurate body composition. That is the reality in our sport. You may lose a period once or twice then, but this prolonged periods of amenorrhea is not healthy for your body. It's also not healthy for your performance. You will not perform as well as you could. You may initially for a short period of time because you're perhaps lighter, and but it'll catch up with you. You will get slower, you will get injured, you will get ill, and you will not train and respond. So number one, it is not okay to train until you lose your period. I often would, before 20 years ago, hear coaches say, well, you're not training hard enough, you still have your period. No, let's put that on the table right now. That is not a mantra that we can support. And we do know that the science is very clear that women that have the periods will perform faster, better, stronger. And we've seen that in some of the science that I showed you today.
Great input. Thanks, Margot. I'd like to switch gears just from the junior performance to just talking about current performance and health, and just get to a little bit more past high school and into university and elite level. We know that social media allows us to see what other people are doing for workouts and training, and that a lot of athletes want to do what the elites are doing and try to mimic certain workouts. I'm just curious, maybe Jen, if you want to address, like, how can you describe the important differences that you had at each level in terms of training volume, lifestyle, maturity, as you moved from junior to university and now elite?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, when I was a youth athlete, social media was just starting. So we had Facebook was just starting to post all of their pictures. You know, everyone wanted to post every picture every day. Whereas now, you know, we're more into Instagram, where you know, you post a very specific picture on a specific day. And oftentimes it is at that period of time where Margot's talking, where you know, our body compositions are catered towards our specific competitions and that elite level. So oftentimes, you know, a lot of the pictures that get posted are actually us on the world stage when we are at our finest. And I think oftentimes it's hard to look at social media and kind of perceive someone's life as you would want to. So, you know, you see a
Jen, you're breaking
picture
up.
of someone eating a meal and you're like, oh, well, they eat hamburgers every day. But in reality, you know, they ate that once. Or, oh, sorry, all good? Am I back? Okay. Yeah, and so, you know, oftentimes you perceive social media as you would like to. On my end, you know, I actually don't spend that much time on there, and I tend to not follow runners just because for young girls it is important to look at that and take it with a grain of salt, because every day, you know, we're out there training and doing a lot of work, and oftentimes all of that work can't be represented on the screen and stuff. For me, you know, I went from there's pictures of me as a youth athlete to now there's pictures of me at the Olympics, and sometimes it is hard to like see yourself and how you've grown. And you know, I went from being a small little twig of an athlete to you know, a girl with a booty. And so oftentimes, you know, I get remarked on you know, my steeple bum, and that's just like, that's my powerhouse. That, like, I like that. And I think that, you know, that was actually brought up in university. Like, one of my teammates just told me one day, she's like, damn, Jen, you're looking good. And I had never been recognized as that. And that just kind of like brought my whole self-awareness into a different place, that, you know, had someone not remarked about it, then you know, I wouldn't have that like power and that ability to like recognize that, yeah, like that's what brings these times. That's what, you know, helps me perform at the top level. And I think oftentimes people look at pictures of different people and they want to be like them, but really they have to recognize that they've got their own set of elements and tool sets to be themselves and the best of themselves.
All right, thanks, Jen. Can you guys hear me? Just say yes, because I can't see you right now.
We can't see you
All
either.
good.
But you can hear me, so you don't need to
Yeah.
see me. That's good. Okay, great. Oh, and share my. Okay, sorry, a little technical difficulties, but yeah, thanks, Jen. I think that's really powerful because we can get caught up in social media, and it is important to note that the reality isn't always what you see through that. And then you make some interesting points about university and having good network and good support system. I want to talk a little bit about the decision to stay in Canada or go to the US for university, because that's often a question. I mean, I now coach at a Canadian university, but I went to school in the US. Melindy went to school in the US. Gabriella, Melissa, Jen stayed in Canada. So, you know, how do you make those decisions and what goes into those decisions? And you know, I'll do a bit of a plug for Canada right now, because I noticed that 10 out of 12 women on last year's World Championship team for the distance women stayed in Canada and were developed through Canada. So maybe, Gabriella, you could talk about what went into your decision around that.
Sure. So I don't really think I was thinking about women's health in the context of my decision to stay in Canada, but and I think it's also easy to kind of you know, paint the NCAA in like the big bad scary light. I think it's a system that has like a lot of merits, and you know, the competition of the NCAA is exceptional and it's very useful for many athletes in their development. That being said, I think that there were lots of benefits for me staying in Canada. You know, the healthcare system is definitely one of them. I got diagnosed with Graves' disease in my first year of university, and that process would have been a lot more complicated had I been in the States. You know, it probably would have been fine, but I just don't know what it would have looked like. And I think the thing that people have to bear in mind when they make their decision, obviously, like money is a consideration as well. So if you need a full scholarship, you might not have that luxury to go to a Canadian school. You know, for me, I had enough scholarships and savings that I could go to a Canadian school. But for me, the biggest consideration was the program. And I was having so much success with my coach, Terry Radchenko, at the time. And we had such a good relationship, and I just trusted him so completely in my development that I knew that I was going to go through this developmental period as a university athlete the best in Canada, and working with Terry and the group that he had, you know, I don't want to say created, but the group that was in Toronto. So that was, for me, I think that's like the biggest thing that people have to, you know, focus on when they're making their decision about university is, you know, what group do you see yourself working the best with? What coach do you, you know, it's hard to do that within a few visits, but like, which coach do you think you can trust the most, that you connect with the best, that you have that, you know, that camaraderie and friendship with? And that should be like top of people's consideration, not necessarily like which school has necessarily the bells and whistles. And then obviously the academic side is something that people have to consider as well. So that was important for me. So, you know, I looked at going to Stanford, and I know Melindy went to Stanford, so she can talk about that as well. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was just, there were a lot of pulls for me to stay in Toronto, and yeah, and I was happy to make that decision. This worked out well, so.
Great, yeah, thanks. And maybe Melindy, yeah, you want to speak to your experiences, because Gabby makes a great point that there are some good programs in the US, and a lot of us have benefited from that. The healthcare system being in Canada, and for Gabby's specific example is a good one. But yeah, maybe you can speak to your experiences having gone south.
Sure, yeah, and actually I'm having a bit of a flashback because Gabby, I don't know if you remember calling and we had a chat about 6 years
I
ago.
remember.
We were considering going to Stanford and we had this conversation and we kind of were like, well, you have such a great situation in Toronto. It's a great university. You're running really well. You have everything you need and the grass isn't always greener, right? It's always easy to
very
say that.
grateful to have that conversation with you.
Yeah, and I remember getting off the phone and saying to my husband, we were driving to Calgary for an Ironman race at 70.3, and I said, she's going to be fast. She has the fire. And so it's been so fun to see you just tear it up since then.
Likewise.
Anyways, yeah, thanks. Anyways, so my decision, kind of like Hillary, like we're like a slightly different generation than, say, Gabby at least. It was 22 years ago that I was a freshman at Stanford. So like it's a generation ago, truly. And I didn't feel that there were as many competitive opportunities in Canada as there are now. And I also really wanted to go somewhere that I knew I would get the education that I was after, and there's great education in Canada. But the program I wanted at Stanford, International Relations, was really a strong program. I really loved the girls on the team. I love California. I mean, you can't beat California in the winter, right? So I made that decision to go, but I had a really tough time for the first few years there. I had 4 back-to-back-to-back stress fractures. I was underperforming. I didn't at all feel like I reached my potential. I considered quitting the sport for a while because I couldn't get out of the injury cycle. I didn't know what was wrong with me. I didn't like being way slower than I had been as a 15, 16, 17-year-old. And I mean, I would credit, again, really strong coaches, both at Stanford. Dina Evans was my coach, and then Mike back in Canada, to really promote like the ideas that a fast body is a strong body, that, I needed that talent doesn't disappear, but sometimes you need to take a break, like take a step back, that is, and really framed it in a way of being patient and not trying to dig a bigger hole. But in the end, I think part of the reason why I was caught in an injury cycle was not fully understanding the consequences of REDS and jumping back into training too soon. And when I talk about REDS, I think for me it was a matter of I only would take 3 meals a day because that's what I had for a board plan. So I ate breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And I didn't snack in between because I lived on campus. I didn't have a grocery store. I wasn't organized enough to go get snacks. So I would go to practice at 3:15, having had lunch at noon and dinners at 6:30. And I wasn't eating. I was in a deficit through the day at periods of the day, even though I maybe catch up at nighttime by having the most enormous dinner ever. But now we know through research that even just that kind of timing of nutrition and recovery can impact your bone health and your recovery. So anyways, taking a step back, I'm kind of like Hillary, I'm coaching in Canada now too. I think there's pros and cons, but I think that people really need to have conversations with coaches, also conversations with the people on the team. Like, is what the coach is saying actually what's being, is there actually follow through? Like, is it a really healthy environment? Are people being supported? Is there positive language around health and eating, and what happens? Or are we turning a blind eye to things because someone's running fast and maybe putting themselves into a situation that's not healthy? So it is complex, but I think that now that there's enough information out there that people can come in and ask really educated questions and hopefully find a really good situation for themselves, whether it's here or there. I think, like we all said, there are pros and cons to both situations.
Great, thanks guys. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just try to take some of these. Now, I'm going to address this with Margot because people are asking questions on amenorrhea and if there's a way to address that through birth control. You mentioned in your presentation that birth control isn't recommended. Can you talk a little bit about specifically birth control as it relates to female hormones and bone density and REDS?
Yes, certainly. The birth control pill, if you put an athlete on the birth control pill, she will have a period, but it's not a normal period. It's a pill-induced period. So what in fact happens is that it gives the woman, the female athlete, a false sense of I'm fine. When in fact the reason the person was amenorrheic in the first place, had no period, was never addressed. So in fact, the best way to address a woman who's not having a period, first of all, make sure she's not pregnant. But in our situation of what we're talking about is quite often due to energy deficit. And you put someone on the pill, you're not addressing the energy deficit. So treat the cause. If they're in low energy availability, improve their energy availability. And when you do that, coincidentally, the periods come back, and then you have a good indication when they're functioning on their own, whether they're keeping up with their energy availability. If you put them on the birth control pill, you can't follow that parameter as a normal function of energy, good energy availability. And so you don't know if they're running into a deficit unless they get injured. Now, the second part of your question was around relationship of health with bone. The birth control pill has a negative impact on bone density. We do not want to make athletes' bones more brittle, more fragile, because we know that we're at risk for stress fractures. So the last thing I do is put a young woman on the birth control pill. Now, if she needs birth control because she's sexually active, then I would recommend an IUD, an intrauterine device, if they are well tolerated, and for the most part, a non-hormonal one. And that leaves the hormonal system untouched so that we can monitor what their body is doing while still giving them birth control and not have the negative effect on their bones. So very important. And I'd just like to briefly comment on Melindy's comment about within day energy deficit. That's maybe getting a bit technical, but you can have at the end of the day a full amount of energy. So you can say, okay, check, I spent 3,000 kilocalories of energy in training and I ate 3,000, so I'm good. But you've been on zero for all day long because you didn't eat all day, you ate it all at nighttime. Well, the body's effects really for most of the day was it was an energy deficit. So the timing before training, the recovery training, and how you space the food out is also as important as the overall number. So thank you, Melindy, for raising that. I hope that answered the first question for you, Hillary.
Yeah, Margot, that's great. And I guess while I have you, answering questions, I think one thing I don't want to run out of time without you answering is, what would you say the top 5 things and signs of RED-S would be that a coach might look for or a parent could look for if they don't have access to this ideal IST? What are, say, 5 things that we should be looking at to then suggest to see a doctor?
Okay, so certainly falling off of performance can be caused by many things, one of which is RED-S, and I certainly want people to think about RED-S if the performance is falling off. Another one would be changes in emotions, changes in focus, irritability, concentration. Another would be GI upset or tummy, the runner's tummy. Quite often that runner's gut may be caused by running, but it may be caused by RED-S as well. Another one is obviously lack of periods, and another one is injury. So those are kind of things to keep an eye on.
Great, thanks. That's perfect. And I think there are some questions about this, and we touched on iron deficiency, but I know that my understanding is that the gut issue that can be attributed with RED signs then can affect the ability to absorb iron. And so somebody asked if we should have regular checks of iron. And I know for myself, and I know many of the women on the panel, likely get iron tested at least twice a year, if not more. So I would say that would be a baseline for something to test and pretty easy to do. Another question, and I can't unfortunately see you guys, so you're just gonna have to jump in, but was if any of you change your training when you have your period? Anyone can jump in because I can't see you. No one?
Mute. We don't change our training. It's something that we tend to just train right through, because we can't always plan when our periods land, and they may land at a major championship. And that's something that I feel anyways, that we need to be prepared to handle if that should happen. And there have been times that it has happened, but like my experience with the period has obviously changed since having a baby as well, but for the most part, I feel like superwoman when I am menstruating. I am unstoppable. That's how strong I feel, and I know it's very different and it's very individual for every athlete. And I think if anybody could take anything away from this thing tonight, is that every individual is different, and this doesn't look the same for everybody else, because none of us have had the same journey to get where we are today. And even just going back to Jen's point about how we look when we are competing in our prime, like we are that lean for such a short amount of time, like literally maybe at the very most 6 weeks out of the year do we look like that. And it's important to be able to put that weight back on and to have those periods again, because it's healthy for your body.
Yeah, that's awesome point, Melissa. I think that's so crucial, and I don't think young athletes understand and try to, they think they're eating super healthy and optimizing body composition, or maybe it's just they think the elites are being really strict all year. And it's really important to understand that not only your performance, but also your health is at risk if you try to restrict what you're eating or try to manage your health, and you can't cut corners. So I think that's really important. A question, Margot, that somebody asked also is about bone health. And if you have been in RED-S, is it possible to regenerate bone, or what is the latest advancements on bone health technology related to that? We can't hear you if you're talking.
Yeah, no, just just repeat that last bit again, because you cut out a little bit, Hillary. Can you just repeat it, please?
Yes. Sorry, Margot. Yes. Can you provide insights into post-RED-S bone density rejuvenation and comment on
Good
any
question.
latest advancements on bone health technology?
Great, super, thank you. You just were cutting out and I couldn't hear you. So absolutely, we do know that bone will respond to appropriate energy availability and appropriate nutrients. And we follow it. It's slow, but it does come back. And if we can intervene younger during that period of bone acquisition, say from a teenager up to about 22 to 24, it comes back much faster. So the earlier we pick it up, the better we have in terms of turning the bone density around. But after that age, it still can get improvements. It's just not as fast. And what can we do to do that, to help with that? There are bone building drugs on the market that we use in menopausal women. They are not indicated for menstruating young women that are healthy premenopausal. So we cannot use those. With the estrogen patch that I talked about with oral progesterone has been shown to improve bone density. And we use that in women that have significant or severe premenopausal women with thin bones. And there are some experimental drugs that we don't use regularly that are showing promise and hopefully will be helpful in the future, because a bone density problem does become an issue over time and can cause significant morbidity over time with fractures as women age. So it's really important. I know most young women don't worry about fractures in the elderly hips, but you would one day when you get there. So we want to prevent that. We don't want sport to be the cause of future health problems.
Great, thanks, Margot. And I guess on that note, what about reproductive health and how RED-S can affect long-term fertility? Melindy and Melissa both have children, and we talk about how pregnancy can affect us as athletes. Maybe you can speak to how having a child has affected your performance, or if any health outcomes after having kids has affected the way that you train. Maybe Melindy, do you want to start?
I didn't intend to be in high performance sport following the birth of either of my children. I kind of retired from track and then had one kid, got into triathlon, had another kid, got into marathoning. So I think for me, it was just like I really listened to my body's cues during pregnancy and postpartum, because I had no agenda and I wasn't trying to get back to a certain level and I wasn't worried about it. Where I see a lot of people, if they're pregnant, while they're still trying to have their careers, you know, Paula Radcliffe comes to mind. I remember seeing her train super hard through her pregnancy and maintain a very high level of fitness. I think my takeaway was that you can actually kind of back off and not do very much, and just focus on, and I think Melissa was the same way. We had a few chats because we were pregnant at the same time with my second and her first, that just enjoy the experience and do everything you can to have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy delivery and a good postpartum recovery. And then it's amazing because, you know, it comes back. Like, you just have to put in 3 or 4 months of consistent training. I did my first marathon 7 months postpartum, and I didn't start training till my baby was 3 or 4 months old, and then things came back pretty quickly. And I think if I had had a performance goal, like something on the calendar, oh, I need to be fit and strong and racing by January, then I would have had a lot of pressure, and it probably would have dug myself a hole, and it wouldn't have been healthy for me or the baby probably.
Great, thanks. Melissa, do you have anything you want to add about your experiences?
Yeah, so I think what mine is kind of the opposite of what Melindy just said, that I did have a goal that I was working towards once I delivered. I wanted to be at the Doha 2019 World Championships, and we had a very long road to get there. Like, I had time after pregnancy to get into shape, and so I think looking back, if I could do it all over again, I would listen to my body more, because I was in such a rush to get fit that it ended up in injury. And you know, just doing all the mom things you have to do with nursing and things like that, I wasn't taking care of myself. I was literally just going out the door to do workouts and coming back and being a mom, and there was no recovery. I wasn't paying attention to what I was eating, and I actually fell into that RED-S umbrella after pregnancy. I ended up with a stress fracture. I had my period though, and I was just in a really, my energy deficiency was so poor and so low. I wasn't eating enough, and I was outputting so much to nurse my daughter, and it was just this vicious cycle. And as soon as I was diagnosed, it was probably when she was about 6 months, it really was just like, okay, like, you need to slow down here and take care of your health, because this is way bigger than sport. And we took the time and we came back, and just with pregnancy, I wasn't able to keep up with the demand that I needed to put on my body in order to get ready for Doha 2019. So we ended up, I just had an injury after injury last summer, and I took a break after the season was over, and that was the best thing for my body, because I haven't been injured since. I've been able to have a proper rest period, which was what my body needed, but we were in such a rush to get, I was in such a rush, my coach may say otherwise, that it really needed a rest. And I think listening to your body is one of the most honest things that you can do.
Thanks, Melissa. I don't think that's dissimilar to other RED circumstances, pre-pregnancy or post. And yeah, I actually was in the study that Margot mentioned in Arizona or Flagstaff, and I learned through that study that I was in energy deficit and my hemoglobin mass was lower. And it's because I had just come back from having a baby. I was nursing, or I had just come off nursing, which makes your bones a little bit more susceptible to bone injuries, and I wasn't getting enough because I was busy and I was at altitude. So it can happen at a later stage in your career if you're not paying attention, right? So it is absolutely crucial, and I think it's important. I'm going to wrap up, but we do have an important question I don't want to miss, and this is for Margot, is what do we do if athletes are showing signs of RED-S and they're not getting their period? Do we have them eat more? How do you track that? Do we train less? What would your suggestions be for that?
Well, as I mentioned, a very good question. I mean, first of all, recognizing it is very important. And I hope through this talk today and everyone sharing their experience that that's been helpful for everyone listening, that they will now know how to recognize some of the signs and symptoms and pitfalls. The second thing is, now that we know, what do we do? And I think it's really important when you're dealing with a health issue, which this is that you get some health support. And that hopefully will be with a sport physician that understands RED-S. There's been a lot of education of sport medicine physicians, and in fact, Canada's developing a pan-Canadian RED strategy thanks to physiologists like Trent Stellenwerf, who's working with us on this. So we're improving the education of all of those involved in sport with how to treat and manage this. So with the sport physiology, the dietitian, the physician, improving the energy availability is the goal, because that's the cause. So you have to reverse that, and working together with that team. And for most of the athletes I treat, it's tweaking the diet. It's increasing the density of the food they take. It's the timing of the food they eat. It's increasing the portions slightly, and working with a physiologist there. I rarely slow down the energy expenses. Sometimes we have to, and then I work with the coach to try and trim the amount of energy expenses. But usually we are very successful by just tweaking the diet to be more energy dense, and better timing around that. And patience, it does work.
Yeah, and I think that's great point, that it can take a long time to get your menstrual cycle back if you've missed it. And so it's crucial to have some patience. We are out of time. We've gone over by 10, 11 minutes, but I really, really appreciate this whole panel's honesty and willingness to talk about the sensitive topics that we discussed today. I think this is crucial in educating other athletes. We had some questions about males being affected in other groups, so I would love to see more discussion in another webinar on this, but thank you so much, everybody. And if you missed this and want to see the viewing as a recording, you can go to AC's website, and it's on the coaching area. So thank you very much, everybody, for participating.
Thanks for having us, Hillary.
Thanks all.